The Whitmore estate looked like something out of an architectural magazine. Grand marble floors, ceilings that stretched into the sky, and windows so tall they seemed to pull sunlight straight from heaven. But inside it was silent. Not the kind of silence that brings peace, but the kind that suffocates, the kind that reminds you of everything you've lost. Ethan Whitmore, 39, billionaire CEO of a global tech empire, wandered those halls like a ghost. 2 years ago, he had it all: a thriving company, the respect of his peers, and most importantly, a family he adored. His wife, Caroline, had been his anchor, his joy. Their little girl, Lily, had been the heartbeat of the home, filling every corner with her laughter, until the accident. One wrong turn, a distracted driver, and everything shattered. Caroline died instantly. Lily, only 2 at the time, survived, but her spinal cord was damaged beyond repair. Now, at 4 years old, she had never walked since, hardly spoke, and flinched at even the softest noises. For 2 years, Ethan had tried everything: specialists, therapists, teachers flown in from across the country. None of them lasted, none of them reached her, and so the house remained quiet, too quiet, echoing with Caroline's absence and the hollow sound of his daughter's silence. And then there was Grace Monroe. She wasn't a doctor or a therapist. She wasn't even formally trained for this kind of care. At 25, she was just a young woman with kind eyes and steady patience, someone whose resume barely filled a page. If you saw her with her hair pulled back in a braid, sneakers worn at the toes, you'd think she belonged behind the counter of a small-town bakery, not inside the mansion of one of America's wealthiest men. Yet somehow she had lasted longer than anyone else. For 3 quiet weeks, Grace moved through the estate like a gentle breeze, cleaning, preparing meals, and staying close enough for Lily to know she wasn't alone, but never pushing, never forcing conversation. Lily didn't speak to her, barely looked at her. Instead, she sat in her wheelchair by the tall bay window, gazing out at the garden, her stuffed bunny always in her lap, her silence a wall no one had managed to climb. Until one quiet Thursday afternoon, Grace was dusting near the piano, her phone playing a soft waltz, when Lily's head turned. For the first time in years, her lips trembled, her voice breaking the silence that had caged her life. "Can you teach me to dance?" she whispered. And in that fragile moment, Ethan, returning home early for once, froze in the doorway. Tears filled his eyes. For the first time in 2 years, his daughter had spoken. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the house was no longer silent. Grace Monroe had learned early what it meant to carry guilt like a second skin. Most people who met her now, quiet, steady, always willing to help, saw only the surface. They saw patience, kindness, and a strange strength that didn't seem to match her age. What they didn't see was the scar that shaped it all. She grew up in a small rental house outside Dayton, Ohio, where money was always tight, and her mother often worked double shifts at the diner just to keep the lights on. Grace was 12 when her younger brother Leo caught a viral infection that left him partially paralyzed. He was only 10, a boy with bright eyes and a crooked smile, the kind of kid who turned every cardboard box into a spaceship and every stick into a sword. But after the illness, everything changed. Leo couldn't run anymore. He couldn't keep up with the other kids at school. Most days he stayed home with Grace while their mother worked. Grace became his shadow, his helper, his protector. She tied his shoes, helped him into bed, read books aloud until her throat hurt. She used to tell herself she was strong enough for both of them. Then came the day that broke her. It was a rainy Tuesday, nothing remarkable. Grace left Leo for just a moment, just to get him a glass of water from the kitchen. She still remembered the sound that followed, the thud, the scream that never came, the silence that felt like the earth had been ripped open beneath her feet. He had tried to follow her. His weak legs had given way on the staircase. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. Grace was only a child herself, but in her mind it was her fault. She should have carried him instead of letting him try. She should have stayed. She should have been stronger. Those 2 words, should have, became her constant companions. The neighbors said it wasn't her fault. The doctors said accidents happen. Her mother said through tears that Leo knew he was loved. But Grace never believed it. She never forgave herself. That night, she promised something she was too young to understand. Never again. Never again would she leave someone vulnerable. Never again would she look away when someone needed her. Never again would she let silence swallow a child's laughter. Years passed, but the weight never left. Grace worked odd jobs, waiting tables, stocking shelves, while drifting from one place to another, never really staying long enough to make roots. Every child she passed on the street, every news story about tragedy, every sound of a kid crying in a grocery store, it all brought back Leo. She carried his memory like a ghost at her side. So when the job at the Whitmore estate opened, Grace almost didn't apply. The ad was vague: light housekeeping, occasional childcare, high security environment. She knew the name, of course, Ethan Whitmore, the billionaire tech mogul, but she didn't imagine she'd stand a chance. Yet somehow she was hired. Maybe it was her references, modest though they were. Maybe it was the way she interviewed, calm, unflinching, willing to say, "I don't know, but I'll learn." Or maybe it was simply that Ethan was running out of people willing to try. From the first day, Grace saw it in Lily's eyes, the same haunted stillness she had seen in Leo's. Not the tantrums of a spoiled child, not the distance of indifference. This was something deeper. It was grief, wrapped around fear, sealed by silence. And Grace understood. She didn't see a broken little girl. She saw a child who had survived too much too soon, just like Leo. She saw someone who needed not fixing, but presence. So she didn't force conversation. She didn't shower Lily with false cheer, she simply stayed. She read quietly in the same room, hummed softly while cleaning, made sure Lily always knew someone was there without demanding her attention. Slowly she left small openings, playing soft music, twirling a dust rag like it was a ribbon, moving through the silence without fear. It wasn't therapy in the traditional sense. It was something simpler. It was the promise Grace had made at 12 years old, whispered into the dark beside her brother's empty bed. "I won't leave you. Not again. Not ever." And when Lily finally turned her head that Thursday afternoon and whispered, "Can you teach me to dance?" Grace felt the earth shift beneath her. It was as though Leo himself had handed her this chance, not to erase the past, but to honor it. Ethan, standing in the doorway that day, could not have known the depth of what had just happened. He saw a spark in his daughter, the first in years. But Grace knew it was more than that. It was redemption. Because for the first time since her brother's fall, she wasn't too late. The Whitmore mansion had always been silent, but lately that silence felt different. It wasn't as heavy as before, not as suffocating. Since Grace Monroe arrived, there was a new kind of stillness, lighter, gentler, almost like the air was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Grace never tried to fill the silence. She didn't force Lily to talk, didn't press her to play or smile. Instead, she introduced small threads of life, soft piano music from her phone while dusting, humming quietly while cooking oatmeal, or reading in the corner while Lily sat by the bay window, her bunny tucked against her chest. Little by little, Lily began to watch her. And then came the day that everything changed. It was a quiet afternoon, golden sunlight pouring through the tall windows. Lily was in her usual spot, wheels locked by the bay window, her blue eyes fixed on the garden beyond. Grace entered with her cleaning caddy, but instead of reaching for the feather duster, she slipped a pale blue ribbon from her pocket, long, silky, the color of a morning sky. "Do you know what this is, Lily?" Grace asked gently, though she didn't expect an answer. She tied one end to a thin wooden stick and began waving it slowly through the air. The ribbon caught the light, curling and twirling, creating spirals that shimmered like water. Grace let it dance above her head, then looped it around her waist, moving with exaggerated care. "This," she said softly, "is how we dance with our hands." She swayed, letting the ribbon draw figure eights in the air, sometimes sweeping it down low, sometimes lifting it high, as if painting music on the walls. She risked a glance at Lily. The little girl was watching, her stuffed bunny sliding slightly from her lap as her hands gripped the wheelchair's armrests. Grace smiled, and sometimes dancers get a little silly. She let the ribbon wrap around her head, crossing her eyes dramatically. "Oh no, I'm lost in my own wings," she exclaimed, stumbling clumsily in circles like a confused swan. The sound came suddenly, soft, fragile, but unmistakable. A giggle. Grace froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Slowly, she turned. Lily's tiny hand covered her mouth, but her shoulders shook, her eyes wide with something Grace hadn't seen in 2 years. Pure, unguarded joy. "You think I'm a bad swan, don't you?" Grace teased, eyes shining. Lily nodded, a smile trembling across her lips. Then hesitantly, she lifted her hand and waved it in a clumsy arc, mimicking the ribbon's dance. The motion was awkward, uncertain, but it was movement. Intentional, expressive. Grace felt her eyes sting with tears. She quickly blinked them back and lifted her ribbon high. "Beautiful," she whispered. "See? You can dance, too, with your hands, with your heart, any way you want." From the second-floor landing, Ethan Whitmore had stopped in his tracks. He had been on his way to the study, another night of emails and conference calls, when he heard something he hadn't heard in years. Laughter. His daughter's laughter. He leaned against the railing, staring down in disbelief. There was Lily, his little girl, her face lit with joy as she flapped her arms like butterfly wings. And there was Grace beside her, guiding without controlling, inviting without demanding. Ethan's chest tightened. He gripped the railing as if steadying himself against a wave. That sound, Lily's laughter, was like a forgotten melody crashing back into his heart. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Down below, Grace twirled again, stumbling dramatically before collapsing onto the carpet with a laugh of her own. Lily giggled louder, clapping her hands. The ribbon slipped from Grace's fingers, and Lily reached for it, holding it like something precious. "You see?" Grace said softly, kneeling beside her. "Even if your legs can't dance, your spirit still can. And your spirit is the most important part." Lily stared at her for a long moment, then almost shyly she whispered, "Butterfly." Grace's throat closed. She placed a hand over her heart. "Yes, sweetheart, a butterfly." Ethan's vision blurred. He turned away, retreating to his office before either of them saw the tears running down his face. He sank into the leather chair, pressing his palms against his eyes, trying to hold himself together. But it was no use. For the first time since the accident, his grief cracked open, not in silence, not in numbness, but in tears. Later that evening, Grace found him standing in the garden, his posture stiff, hands shoved deep in his pockets. She hesitated before stepping closer. "She laughed today," Grace said softly. Ethan's jaw flexed, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I heard." Grace tilted her head, studying him. He looked like a man built out of iron and glass, strong, unyielding, but one crack away from shattering. "You know," she whispered, "sometimes kids don't need fixing. Sometimes they just need someone willing to look foolish until they remember how to smile." For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. Then his voice broke low, almost a whisper. I'd forgotten what her laughter sounded like. Grace placed the ribbon gently into his hand. "Then don't forget again." Ethan looked down at the ribbon, turning it slowly between his fingers, and for the first time in years, a faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. The next morning dawned brighter than usual at the Whitmore estate, as if the house itself sensed something shifting. Sunlight filtered through gauzy curtains, spreading across the polished marble floors. Grace carried a tray of breakfast into the living room, humming softly. She paused mid-step. Something new stood in the corner near the bay window where Lily always sat. It wasn't just a wheelchair. It was unlike anything Grace had ever seen. The frame gleamed pearl white, curving in delicate arcs that looked almost floral. The wheels shimmered faintly, their rims lined with soft pink. A pale satin bow was tied at the back like a dancer's ribbon, and the seat was cushioned with rose-colored velvet, the fabric stitched so carefully it looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. The entire design was lightweight, graceful, built not just for mobility but for movement, for dancing. Grace's breath caught in her throat. She turned slowly toward Lily, who had just been wheeled in by Mrs. Langford, the housekeeper. The little girl froze, her big blue eyes widening at the sight. For a moment Lily didn't speak. Her small fingers gripped the armrests of her old chair. Then, hesitantly, she reached out toward the gleaming frame, her hand trembling as if afraid it might vanish like a dream. Grace crouched down beside her. "What do you think, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Lily's voice was a whisper. "It's mine?" Before Grace could answer, footsteps echoed from the archway. Ethan stood there, his tall frame half hidden in shadow. His eyes moved from his daughter to the chair, then back again. For the first time there was uncertainty on his face. Not his usual control, not his businesslike composure, but the vulnerable hesitation of a father afraid of giving too much hope. Lily's gaze locked with his. "Daddy?" she whispered. Ethan swallowed hard. He gave the faintest nod, and just like that, Lily let out a soft gasp. She hugged the side of the chair as if it were a doll, burying her face into the velvet armrest. Her small shoulders shook, not from fear this time, but from joy she didn't yet have words for. Grace's hand rose instinctively to her chest. She glanced at Ethan. He quickly turned his head, one hand pressed against his face, trying to shield the raw emotion flooding through him. His shoulders trembled despite his effort to stay composed. "She's never held anything that tightly before," Grace whispered, her voice breaking. "Not even her bunny." Ethan froze mid-step but didn't turn around. Grace didn't push. She simply placed a hand lightly on the back of Lily's new chair. "She knows it was from you," she added softly. For Ethan, those words landed with weight. He had spent 2 years watching his daughter slip further and further away, believing she saw him only as a distant figure moving through rooms, too buried in grief to reach her. And yet here she was, hugging a gift he had chosen, holding on to it as though it were him. That night, Grace wheeled Lily into her bedroom. The pink-ribboned chair glowed under the lamplight, parked carefully beside her bed. Lily refused to let go of it, her small hands tracing the polished spokes until her eyes grew heavy. When sleep finally came, she curled against her bunny with one hand still resting on the velvet cushion. From the hallway, Ethan stood watching. He thought he had hidden well in the shadows, but Grace noticed him. His expression was a storm of emotion, relief, sorrow, tenderness, fear. A man who had conquered markets and boardrooms but now stood powerless before the fragile miracle of his daughter's trust. Grace didn't disturb the moment. She whispered only one thing, her words barely audible over the hum of the lamp. "She feels safe again." Ethan's throat tightened. He looked once more at Lily's small hand resting on the chair, then turned away, retreating into the long corridor. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a ghost walking those halls. He felt like a father again. Over the next few days, the chair became more than a gift. It became a bridge. Each morning, Lily insisted on being wheeled out into the garden, her ribboned wheels gliding smoothly over the grass. Sometimes she asked Grace to play music so she could twirl in slow circles, laughing when the chair spun just a little too quickly. And sometimes, to Grace's quiet amazement, Lily looked for her father. "Daddy, watch," she called one morning, her voice carrying across the lawn. Ethan, who had been lingering on the patio with his coffee, froze. It had been years since his daughter had asked for his attention so openly. Slowly, he lowered his cup and walked closer. Lily grinned and spun the chair in a quick half-circle, her curls bouncing with the movement. "See? I can dance!" Ethan's lips parted. His chest tightened. And then, before he could stop himself, he smiled. A real smile. Unguarded, radiant. The kind he thought he had buried with Caroline. Grace, watching from the garden path, saw it. Her own heart tightened as she realized what was happening. The chair wasn't just helping Lily. It was healing Ethan, too. It was reminding him that he wasn't just a CEO, not just a widower trapped in grief. He was a father, and his daughter still needed him. That evening, Ethan lingered in the living room as Grace helped Lily prepare for bed. He tucked the blanket under her chin, his large hands clumsy but careful. Lily caught his wrist before he could move away. "Thank you, Daddy," she whispered. Ethan's breath caught. His eyes shimmered in the dim light. "For what, sweetheart?" Lily's voice was soft but steady. "For my wings." He bent his head, pressing a trembling kiss to her forehead. When he pulled back, Grace saw the truth etched across his face. The ice that had held him captive for so long was melting drop by drop with every word his daughter spoke. And for the first time, the Whitmore mansion no longer felt like a mausoleum. It felt like the beginning of home again. The garden had become their sanctuary. Each morning, Grace wheeled Lily across the manicured lawn, the soft earth beneath the chair making her giggle as if the whole world was bouncing with her. Daniel, though he rarely admitted it, often lingered on the patio, coffee cooling in his hand just to watch. It was the one place where Lily seemed free, where the walls of the estate couldn't contain her spirit. On that particular morning, the sky was painted a perfect blue. Grace pulled her phone from her pocket, letting a gentle piano piece drift through the air. Lily clapped her hands. "Let's dance," she squealed, spinning her pink-ribboned chair in tight circles. Grace laughed, pretending to stumble dramatically. "Whoa, don't make me dizzy, butterfly." Daniel smiled faintly from the patio, his chest tightening with pride. Then, unexpectedly, Lily turned toward him. "Watch this, Daddy," she called. Her voice rang across the garden, bold and bright. Daniel straightened, startled at how easily she had called to him. And then it happened. Lily pushed her wheels too hard, too fast, hitting a small, uneven patch of grass. The chair jolted. In one terrible instant, she pitched forward, tumbling onto the ground with a sickening thud. The music stopped. The birds fell silent. Grace dropped the ribbon and ran, her heart slamming against her ribs. "Lily!" The little girl curled into herself, arms wrapped over her head, rocking violently. Her breaths came in sharp, shallow gasps, eyes wide with terror. The panic wasn't just about the fall, it was the memories, the crash, the trauma she still carried. Grace dropped to her knees beside her. "Sweetheart, it's okay," she whispered. Her hands trembled as she reached out, but Lily flinched at the touch, covering her ears, sobbing uncontrollably. Daniel was there in seconds, his face pale as he scooped his daughter into his arms. She clung to him desperately, burying her face into his chest, her tiny body shaking like a leaf in the wind. He looked at Grace, his eyes filled with fear but not blame. Still, the sight broke her. She had promised herself never again. Never another child, never another fall. That night, the house returned to silence, but not the hopeful kind. Grace sat in her small room, a half-written letter trembling in her hands. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. "I thought I could carry this," she whispered to herself, "but today proved me wrong." She folded the paper with shaking fingers, placed it gently on the hallway console, and slipped out before dawn. When Daniel came downstairs an hour later, he found the note. He unfolded it slowly, his hands tightening with every line. "I thought I was ready to protect her, but I failed again. I let another child fall. I cannot stay and cause her more pain. Please tell Lily I'm sorry." The words blurred as his vision filled with tears. With a sharp breath, he crumpled the letter in his fist. "No," he muttered, his voice breaking. "Not again." The sky outside had opened into rain, steady and cold, but Daniel didn't care. He grabbed his keys, his coat forgotten. The tires of his car hissed across wet asphalt as he tore through the city, his heart pounding louder than the storm. He knew where she would go. Grace's tiny apartment across town, the one she had once admitted felt too quiet, even for me. When he reached it, he pounded on the door, rain dripping down his face, his shirt plastered to his skin. The door cracked open. Grace stood there soaked, her hair clinging to her cheeks, eyes red and swollen. She froze when she saw him. "Daniel!" He held up the letter, his voice raw. "You think leaving fixes this?" Her lips trembled. "I heard her. She felt—" "She's a child," he cut in sharply. "Kids fall. Life falls. What matters is what happens after." Grace shook her head, tears spilling freely. "I should have caught her. I should have protected her. Instead, I froze just like before. I let my brother fall, and now—" Daniel stepped forward, his voice firm. "You didn't let her fall. You stayed. You were there when she needed you. You held her through the fear. You whispered her back to calm. That's not failure, Grace. That's love." Her knees buckled slightly, the weight of her guilt pressing down. "She had a panic attack. Because of me." Daniel's voice softened, breaking. "Did you see what she did before the fall? She called out to me. She believed in herself. That belief came from you." He opened his fist, letting the crumpled letter fall to the floor, sodden with rain. His voice dropped to a whisper. "You're not her maid. You're not an employee. You're the only person who's made her feel like a little girl again. You're the light she clings to when the world goes dark." Grace covered her mouth, sobs shaking her frame. "Then let me try again," she whispered. "Not for a job, for her, for you, for us." Daniel's chest heaved as he reached for her hand. His voice was hoarse. "Then come home, she's waiting for you." And just like that, something shifted. Grace nodded, stepping into the rain, into his arms, into the place she had always belonged but never believed she deserved. For the first time in years, Daniel didn't feel like he was holding the pieces of a broken life. He was holding hope. The auditorium was hushed, the kind of silence that trembled with anticipation. Soft golden lights bathed the stage, casting a glow on satin curtains and polished wood. Families, nurses, therapists, and volunteers filled the rows. It wasn't just an event, it was a celebration of survival, a showcase called Revival Through Motion, created to honor the progress of children fighting to reclaim their lives. Daniel sat in the front row, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. Beside him, Grace's fingers trembled against her lap. Neither of them had spoken much since arriving. They didn't need to. Their eyes stayed on the stage, waiting, praying. Backstage, Lily sat in her custom chair, dressed in a delicate white dress with tiny pearls stitched along the neckline. Her hair had been braided and tied with a satin ribbon. Grace crouched in front of her, adjusting the straps of her shoes. "You ready, sweet girl?" she whispered. Lily nodded, her small hand gripping Grace's wrist. "I think Mommy would love this," she said softly. Grace's throat tightened. She bent forward, pressing her forehead gently against the little girl's. "She'd love it more than anything." Then came the hush, the music starting. A lone piano began the tender notes of Claire de Lune. Lily had chosen it herself. It was the piece Julia, her late mother, used to hum while holding her close. The curtain rose and the spotlight washed over her. She wheeled herself slowly to center stage. For a moment, she froze. Dozens of eyes watched her, strangers and loved ones alike. The weight of it pressed on her tiny shoulders, but then she saw them. Her father in the front row, Grace beside him, both smiling through tears, and Lily took a breath. Her arms floated into the air, delicate and precise, as though she had been born to move this way. The ribbon Grace had tied to the back of her chair shimmered as she spun in slow circles. Her head tilted with the music, her face alive with expression. Wonder, joy, something freer than words. The audience leaned forward, spellbound. Grace pressed a hand to her mouth, her heart pounding. Daniel's chest ached with every movement, every flick of his daughter's wrists. He had seen her broken, silent, paralyzed by grief. Now she was luminous, commanding the stage as if the accident had never stolen her spirit. And then it happened. The music swelled, building toward its tender climax. Lily's hands gripped the sides of her chair. Her arms trembled with effort. Slowly she shifted forward. Daniel shot halfway out of his seat. Grace clutched his arm. "Wait," she whispered, her voice trembling. Lily pressed down. Her feet touched the stage floor. Gasps rippled through the audience. The spotlight caught the shimmer of tears on her cheeks as she strained, her small legs wobbling, unsteady. And then, with every ounce of strength, she rose. She was standing. For the first time since the crash, Lily stood tall, the music soaring around her like a tide. Her arms lifted wide, trembling but free as though she were taking flight. The audience erupted. Some sobbed, some clapped their hands to their mouths in disbelief. Daniel's vision blurred as he stumbled toward the stage, his chest breaking open with a cry. "My baby girl," he whispered hoarsely, his tears spilling without restraint. Grace was right behind him, her eyes streaming. Lily took one shaky step forward, then another. She turned toward the crowd, toward her father, her smile radiant, her whole being glowing with triumph. "Daddy, look!" she cried, her voice high and clear. And then, exhausted, she collapsed, straight into Daniel's waiting arms. He caught her as though he'd been preparing his whole life for this single moment. He held her close, trembling, his voice cracking against her hair. "You're dancing, sweetheart. You're truly dancing." Lily giggled through tears, her face buried against his chest. "I did it, Daddy," she whispered. "Yes," he choked out, pressing his lips to her curls. "You really did." Grace knelt beside them, wrapping her arms around both. For a moment, time stopped. No wealth, no titles, no grief. Just a father, a daughter, and the woman who had breathed light back into their lives. The applause thundered, echoing through the hall, but the only sound that mattered was Lily's laughter, pure, unbroken, alive. When the curtain fell, the world outside seemed brighter. That night, back at the estate, Lily refused to sleep without her ribbon in hand. Daniel carried her upstairs, whispering promises against her forehead. Grace lingered in the doorway, watching. For the first time in years, the house no longer felt haunted. It pulsed with hope. And Daniel knew, with a clarity sharper than anything he had felt in boardrooms or business victories, that this was his true empire. Not companies or profits, but the fragile, miraculous laughter of his little girl. The weeks after the recital blurred into something Daniel hadn't dared dream of: normalcy. Joy threaded itself into the house like sunlight seeping through heavy curtains. Every morning Lily woke with renewed determination, eager to practice walking again. At first it was small, 3 shaky steps with Grace holding her hands, then 5, then 10. Each step was celebrated like a miracle. Daniel, once a man chained to work and grief, found himself clearing his schedule, trading boardrooms for backyards, conference calls for afternoons in the garden where his daughter's laughter replaced the sound of quarterly reports. Grace designed gentle exercises for Lily, turning therapy into games. They danced with ribbons in the garden, balanced with painted stepping stones, and clapped in rhythm to soft music. Daniel watched, sometimes joining in, often making Lily laugh with his clumsy attempts at twirls. "Daddy, you're worse than the swan," she'd giggle, collapsing into Grace's lap. And with every moment, the distance between father and daughter shrank. It wasn't just Lily who was healing. Daniel himself had begun to thaw. He found himself wandering into the kitchen to help Grace with dinner, laughing when she teased him for burning toast, or lingering in the living room while she read aloud to Lily. Their silences grew warmer, no longer haunted but comfortable, like 2 people sharing the same rhythm without needing to name it. Then came the morning that changed everything. Daniel was pouring orange juice in the kitchen when he heard it, tiny, deliberate footsteps. He froze, the glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the tile. He turned, breath caught in his throat. Lily stood there in her little yellow dress, curls bouncing, her smile wide as the sky. She lifted her arms proudly. "Look, Daddy, no wheels." Daniel's knees gave way as he dropped to the floor, scooping her up into his arms. He spun her in a circle, both of them laughing and crying at once. "My brave girl, my miracle," he whispered against her hair. Grace, standing in the doorway, covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. When Daniel's eyes met hers across the room, there was something new there. Not just gratitude, not just admiration, but love. A love neither of them could ignore any longer. 3 weeks later, the Whitmore estate bloomed with pastel balloons and twinkling lights. The garden had been transformed for Lily's 5th birthday. There was a swan-shaped cake, tiny crowns for every child, and a dance floor strung with fairy lights. Lily was radiant, twirling across the grass with her friends, her laughter like bells in the evening air. Grace hovered nearby, arranging gifts and making sure every child had a slice of cake. She looked beautiful in a simple dress, her golden hair loose around her shoulders, her smile glowing as brightly as the lanterns strung above. Daniel watched her, his chest aching with a feeling he could no longer contain. As the party neared its end, Lily disappeared into the house with her best friend Mia. When she returned, she carried a small white velvet box with both hands, balancing it carefully as though it held something sacred. She marched across the grass, her little feet steady and determined until she stood in front of Grace. "Miss Grace," she said, her voice clear and sweet, "will you be my mommy?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. Grace's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears shimmered instantly in her eyes. Daniel stepped forward, taking the box gently from Lily's hands. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he lowered himself to one knee right there in the garden. "Grace Monroe," he said, his voice steady, though his eyes glistened. "I've loved you for longer than I knew how to admit. You came into our lives when we were drowning in shadows. You gave Lily her laughter, and you gave me back my heart." He opened the box. Inside was a delicate ring that caught the golden glow of the lantern light. "You weren't just a caretaker, Grace. You were our miracle, our anchor, our family. Will you marry me?" Grace's hands shook as tears spilled freely down her cheeks. She looked at Daniel, then at Lily, who was bouncing excitedly, clasping her hands as if the answer could change the stars. Grace's voice broke into a whisper. "Yes, yes, of course." Daniel rose, sliding the ring onto her trembling hand before pulling her into his arms. Lily squealed with delight, wrapping her little arms around both of them. The garden erupted in cheers and applause, but in that moment, there was only the 3 of them, father, daughter, and the woman who had stitched their broken pieces back together. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the lanterns glowed softly in the quiet, Grace sat on the porch swing with Lily curled against her side. Daniel joined them, sliding an arm around Grace's shoulders. Lily looked up sleepily, her voice soft. "We're a family now." Grace kissed her forehead. "Yes, sweetheart, a forever family." Daniel tightened his arm around them both, pressing a kiss into Grace's hair. "And this," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "is just the beginning." For the first time in years, the Whitmore estate no longer felt like a monument to grief. It felt like home. The Whitmore estate no longer echoed with silence. Instead, it pulsed with laughter, music, and the quiet rhythm of a family learning how to live again. Lily filled the hallways with her footsteps, tiny, steady, miraculous sounds that Daniel once thought he'd never hear. Grace, now more than a caretaker, had become the heart of their home, her warmth woven into every corner. And Daniel, the man who once hid behind boardroom walls in grief, finally allowed himself to breathe, to feel, to love again. It hadn't been an easy road. There were nights of doubt, mornings of fear, and moments when it seemed too painful to go on. But each stumble had carried a lesson. Each tear had watered the soil for something new to grow. And slowly, what had once been broken became whole again. Their story was never about perfection. It was about presence. About a little girl who dared to whisper, "Can you teach me to dance?" About a woman who carried her own scars but chose to stay, to believe, to love anyway. About a father who thought he had nothing left only to discover that love had been waiting in the smallest gestures, the quietest moments, all along. And maybe that's the greatest lesson. Healing doesn't arrive in grand gestures or overnight miracles. It comes in ribbons twirling in the garden, in laughter shared over burned toast, in trembling hands reaching out and finding another hand willing to hold on. Lily's first steps weren't just hers. They belonged to all of them. Proof that even after devastation, life can bloom again. Proof that family isn't always born from blood, but from the courage to open your heart when it would be easier to keep it closed. As the sun dipped low on Lily's 5th birthday, Daniel held Grace close, Lily twirling around them with a crown sliding off her curls, and he realized something he wished he'd known all along. Brokenness isn't the end. It's the place where love begins to write its most beautiful stories. And so, dear listener, maybe this story is a reminder for you too, that no matter what storms you've walked through, no matter what you've lost or how heavy your guilt feels, you are not beyond repair. Healing may come slowly, quietly, one shaky step at a time, but it comes. And sometimes it brings with it a family, a love, a home you never expected. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from, or what part of this journey resonated most with you. And don't forget to subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories, so you never miss the next tale that may remind you, as this one did, that love always finds a way back. Because sometimes the most beautiful beginnings are born from broken places.